Hello, the masked man.
Hey,
Hello, George.
hi. I am downtown. I just came out of the store and now I'm going to go home. So this is the best it's going to be for half an hour or so.
Oh, okay.
I can take my mask off.
Are you in your car or
Yes, yes.
uh-huh. Okay.
This will be like George Ferrick last week. You'll see nothing but the
Yeah.
roof shortly.
Okay. We could see you better actually if you can put your phone where, your face is in the center of it. Your mirror is very nice.
I guess I can leave this on my lap. Uh, it's my iPad.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that'll work.
Or hold it on the steering wheel, perhaps. Here comes
Yeah.
John.
Yeah, okay.
Good morning.
Hello, John. How are you today?
I am well and in super hot Palm Desert.
Oh my goodness. Well, I am well and in super cool Redondo Beach.
Well, thank God
It is now
air,
71.
my air conditioning is great, but we're headed for 110 or thereabouts.
Ah, yes. Yeah.
George Crook, how are you?
I'm okay, John. How are you?
Excellent, thanks. You heard what I said about Palm Desert and the hot weather.
Yeah, I wonder about your sanity. If you, why would you go out there?
Contractors doing work for me. I'm amazed these guys, what they can do in the heat, but they know how to keep hydrated, I guess.
Yeah, and if they don't do what they do in the heat, their family doesn't eat.
Precisely, yeah. And
Here comes Fred.
morning, Fred.
Connecting to audio. Connecting.
Test it, Fred. 1, 2, 3.
Still says he's connecting. I don't know if he can hear us. There he goes. There it's connected. Hello, Fred.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
George is driving. I don't know if you're headed to office or where.
No, I'm headed back home. I've been running errands.
Okay, well, drive safely. Don't look down.
I just wouldn't want to deprive you guys of the glow of my countenance.
Well, that's true, and we're very grateful for that.
As well, you should be.
And the camera angle actually has you looking up as if you're seeing the beatific vision. So don't drive in a way that hastens that point.
It's you guys.
Okay.
You've got your iPhone up on the dash, yeah?
I'm going to put this on my seat. I don't think it's indispensable that you guys see my face for the next 20 minutes or so.
Well, it's not indispensable. We'll just look at the.
You have to muddle through.
At the dome light of your car. Yeah.
I don't want to be tempted to try to look at yours while I'm driving.
Please don't.
Yeah. Okay. But I can hear you.
Is Ferrick out and Shavira in?
Well, I don't know. Nobody, it's just the four of us who are in at the moment.
It looked like Ferrick was saying he had a canine responsibility.
That may be. I guess I didn't check it. I was too busy reading the stuff that he sent or referred to.
He's a good reader, isn't he?
Oh, yeah. Very wide ranging.
Mhm.
You know, it just dawned on me. I don't know, George, if you're on the freeway or not, but at any point that you are stopped, maybe you could put the camera up on the dashboard facing out the window and we can watch where you're going.
This is just basically downtown LA.
You can,
And
you,
you'll-
you, and you can, you know, put it on the main camera, not the face camera. But,
uh,
but whatever you do, do it safely.
Yeah, no, I'm just gonna, this is working. I can hear you and I'm not hopelessly distracted with the logistics of the thing.
Good.
Okay, good.
Fred, anything new in Boston this week?
No, I mean, I just, last Wednesday, the Wednesday before last, I had a new pacemaker put in
Yes.
to synchronize my heart. And they also put in a defibrillator, which I'm told could save my life, which I would be glad if that happened.
That would be,
And then I had the first checkup and they said it's healing beautifully and so forth.
Good.
Ned.
The pulmonary person, because I have COPD,
There's Ned.
Hello, Ned.
much better than usual. So
George, can you hear us?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, because I paused your video. So we
Okay,
just see your name up instead of you. Sort of like I
Ned.
was for a lot of last week.
For Ned's benefit, George is driving on his way home. And that's why we can hear him, but not see him.
I'm coming from Cotter's Religious Goods Emporium.
Wow, there's a flashback.
Yeah,
I haven't been there in probably 20 years.
well, you have from the level of the artwork that's being purveyed, et cetera, you haven't missed much.
That's what I'm, you know, the reason why actually I was turned off on Cotter's 20 years ago was whoever that old lady was who ran the book department insisted on listening to Rush Limbaugh,
Oh my God.
high volume. And I just couldn't take that no more.
Oh my gosh.
Had you have disappeared.
she's probably not vaccinated. So good idea.
The screener has touched us.
It's so amazing that people politicize vaccination.
Isn't it?
Oh,
But
yeah.
I don't know if you saw, Phil Berryman had a piece this past week, and he talked about how so many of the people in the press are manufacturing materials. They'd be out of work if they didn't manufacture issues like that. They're just, and it's on both sides, but I'm of the opinion that Prager and Hansen and some of those Fox News people are prime offenders. They just create material for which they can then publish and get paid.
Oh, yeah.
I'll have to tune in.
Now, where was Phil? Where was Phil on?
He was on that interchange that Tom Cotton, Bernie Brakel, Bob Ridley.
Oh, the LA Thems.
Yeah,
Oh, okay. So he was writing it, in other words.
yeah,
It wasn't, oh, okay. Gotcha.
that's right.
I saw
Fred, I
John
want to share
somehow-
something. I
somehow
want to
some-
share something with Fred about the defibrillator. You may remember I grew up in a machine shop family, and wouldn't you know, the inventor of the paddles that were used as defibrillators in surgery
Yeah.
came to my dad, and they built the prototypes of those paddles that were used in surgery to defib a heart during heart surgery. And so I got to see the prototype of what now is so miniature that they can put it inside your body.
Mhm.
Isn't that amazing? So he was,
That would have been about 1958 or 60.
My goodness.
you were a seminarian.
I was, and I got to work in the machine shop during the summertime.
Hey,
So you and Norm Supanchek shared parental occupations more or less in common.
Close. The Supancheks were in the sheet metal business.
Yeah.
And the Grimmers in the machine shop business. Yep.
Yeah.
But they knew each other and exchanged customer referrals and such. And drives with our station wagons from Long Beach area to the seminary and back.
How about that?
how many kids in your family then, John?
How many? I'm the first of 5 children.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful.
So it's 3 boys and 2 girls, and every one of us 5 worked in the machine shop at one point or another. So good exposure.
Yep. Where was it?
Long Beach, North Long Beach, South
Oh.
Street between Paramount and Downey Avenue.
You got that down.
Oh, I had to, when I worked in the office, I had to give people directions how to find us, to bring in their parts or whatever.
Does the building still exist?
It does not. Actually, Gremmer Machine and Tool made a great profit on that land because a Korean company decided to move their US headquarters to that area, and
Mhm.
they bought up a full square block, including the Gremmer Machine and Tool. And so my brother Mike was able to make a profit for the business and move it to Santa Fe Springs and get a big 2-story building out of what they paid for our family property there.
So
And what is it now? Does it still exist?
Actually, no. In a nutshell, Mike sold the business about 3 years ago, and the purchasers had another machine shop business in the South Bay, and they essentially defaulted on their payments, and he took it back, and because he'd already retired, just shut it down. So at last look, the sign Gremmer Machine and Tool is still up on that corner, but everything is closed down.
Mhm.
Real estate people are, let's see what happens.
was it, were they producing things or repairing things?
Oh, it was almost all producing.
Oh,
When my dad started with a partner who eventually retired and sold out, there was a fair amount of repair. And they still occasionally did that. Would you know Sully Miller Contracting? You see them doing pavement programs and so on. They were right across the street from us. So if a piece of equipment broke down, they would either bring the broken part in or make a sketch, and Dad or his partner would do that. But as time went along, that became less and less, and more was production of parts of various types.
oh yeah.
Well, so much now is being done by computer design and what they call it, 3-dimensional printing.
That's exactly right. Yep.
And
So it went in stages from a machinist looking at the blueprint and making the part to fit the blueprint. Then it went to what were called automatic machines, where the customer would send a disk of what they wanted made, insert it in the machine, and then just insert the proper material, turn it on and run it. And now it's gone the next level beyond that.
Mhm.
Who would the customers be?
Scholey Manufacturing Company would be a company that made packaging materials. Do you remember? Well, you can still buy tomato juice and orange juice in plastic bags that are inside of a box.
Mhm.
Well, that company manufactured machines that went all over the world for packaging. And so we made the prototypes, and then my dad was really smart. He kept the secret of the filling heads. He was so good at it, they could never reproduce it. So for 30 years, we went from prototypes to filling heads, and they could never reproduce what Bremer Machine and Tool would do. So my brother Mike, after 30 years, was still making filling heads for Scholey Container Corporation. But there were laboratories and pharmaceutical manufacturing companies that would need parts for their facilities, and we'd either do the repair or create the new parts for them.
So you came by your brains, honestly.
Well, my brother Mike got the brain for that in particular, if you know what I mean.
Sure, yeah.
I'm a big fan of the Called and Gifted program, and it just made me so aware of how everybody's got their own unique gifts, which, you know, that's a part of what we're into right now. Is you take a look at some of it's inherited, some of it is skill built over time. Fascinating how Lonergan's triggering lots of reflection on exactly that.
The other thing that's interesting, I rarely meet anyone who has firsthand contact with a person who sells producer goods to other producer goods sellers.
Yes.
It's not consumer goods. You wouldn't go in there as an ordinary customer and ask for one of those tops of a that you
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
totally different.
You know, it brings to mind there was a priest from Nigeria. God help Nigeria these days.
Yes, oh my.
But a priest from Nigeria who, you know, there was often an African priest in residence at Our Lady of Assumption in Claremont. And they would come for various reasons, kind of at the permission of their bishop, to, you know, take a breather or to learn about America or to go to school or whatever. This fellow came, basically, his name was Agapitus. And he came basically to be on a sabbatical, but as with so many of them, it was a fundraising sabbatical.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And his idea, and this was totally self-generated, was he was working with young men in his country village in Nigeria, trying to find some solution to unemployment. And what he did, and I think was part of the intention of his coming to the States, he made contact with a lot of machine manufacturing people, of whom there were a number of those types of heads of those companies in Claremont. And what he would do is try to get from them equipment that they were about to replace. And he sent it home specifically so that the um, the young men that he was trying to teach could use those tools to machine the equipment needed to refine palm oil. Because palm oil in that area, is very, very plentiful. But
Yep.
so much of it is the Western companies come in and they harvest and they produce produce it using virtually slave labor.
Capitalizing on it.
Yeah.
Yep.
And he figured, if we just had the tools to do that ourselves, we could capitalize on all of that. When you left, I lost touch with him, but it's, to my mind, it was that sort of thing that was extremely important for the church in developing countries to
Sure.
promote. And
Before we get away from it, would you go back to his first name and tell me if it came from agape?
I think it, I could be wrong here. I think it was agapitos. It probably is related to agape. However, it's a saint's name. Agapitus of Palestrina in Wikipedia. Martyr and saint, died in 274. And
So there's a saint name there.
yeah,
Got it.
so
In the hills outside of Rome.
right,
Ah.
Palestrina.
Yeah.
Yeah, says no, that was something else. Let's see if there is an etymology of his name.
While you're looking for that, you resolved the problem when last week we couldn't see you active. We had to look at a still picture. Was that simply a
Which we now
glitch?
have to do with George Crook because he's because are you still there, George?
I am. I'm almost home.
Oh, marvelous. Yeah, basically I had upgraded to the latest revision of the operating system, OS 10 Big Sur, and the Zoom apparently needed to be restarted along with the computer being restarted in order to make the connection.
Simple solution, just
Simple solution. I didn't want to do it while we were talking.
on the fly would have been,
That
yep.
would have cut all of you off.
Fred, do you mind me asking, was Lonergan a smoker or a heavy smoker, or did that contribute to his lung cancer?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When I would go to his room to ask him questions and stuff, he had a big round ashtray, and he would finish one cigarette and light up another. So if he was praying or sleeping, he wasn't smoking, but otherwise.
Well, you know the old story about whether you can pray while you're smoking or smoke while you're praying.
No.
That seminarian went to the spiritual director and asked if he could smoke while he was praying, and the spiritual director said, absolutely not. You have to concentrate fully on your prayer. The next seminarian comes in and asked if he could pray while he was smoking, and the spiritual director says, well, of course, you must pray always. Of course you can pray while you're smoking.
How's that consistency?
So anyway, what are we going to do about Lonergan?
Well, it's kind of out of our hands, isn't it? He's gone to his reward.
I mean, about Miller's You know what I mean.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, we're waiting for you, Tomas.
Well, I
Are
gave
you
you
gonna-
half the book.
Oh, did you? Okay, I got
I thought-
through my
I-
radar.
I only reviewed the first chapter that you said.
Yeah, well, I was delayed. I was late on it, but again, I figured out what I was doing wrong that was producing all kinds of crud and problems. And now the machine works just gloriously.
Good for you. Good for us.
I don't know if any of you looked at that.
Yep.
that
I
video.
particularly liked the questions at the end of chapter 1.
Yeah, weren't they nice?
I thought that was brilliant exercise.
I
Anybody else get to that?
Oh,
Or,
yes, yes.
or
I
try it?
that too. Usually they're usually throwaway questions at the end of chapters.
Yes.
But
So
these
the
were
first
very down to
thing,
earth and important.
Ned and George, the first is, what do I like about me? It's a reflective thing. Charlie Miller used to do that when we did speech classes. How did I feel about my presentation? Remember, that was before the class got to speak and before they played back the recording. But anyway, it starts with what did I like about me? And then in section A, who or what supported or did I rest on to develop those things? And then B, how do I pay tribute to them and to what God has given me through nature? Like, I grew up in Southern California, for God's sake. You know, I got to play sports all year round, that kind of thing. Anyway, I'll just say that was a big gift for me.
And the thing George sent about Ken, he explained why he likes himself as a counselor, I think.
Yes.
How a disastrous experience really led into his ability to understand how the things that occur to you, even if they're awful, can be occasions for learning,
Yes.
or asking further questions.
Yeah. Yeah. I was very impressed by him.
Oh, me too.
Yeah. I hadn't heard of him before.
I was ready to hire him.
Ah, yes.
Wait, about whom are you talking?
George Ferrick sent a couple of articles about, what was his name, Ken Moore? Was it? I think I've got it on my tablet here.
Gee, where was I? How come?
But it was completely in the vein of what John was saying about that question.
Yeah.
I think in a way he was answering
Yeah.
the question for
He's
us.
a black psychologist, therapist who did who had one of those terrible experiences with the police as a teenager, and reflected considerably on it as, I think even using it as a, if I remember rightly, using that sort of thing as a tool for helping people ask the questions of, you know, what is behind your trauma or your dysfunction. I think that's kind of what I got out of it. It was several days ago that I read it, and I haven't really been back to it.
But it really made me reflect on the good counselors and or spiritual directors that I've experienced in my life. And then I heard from Bernie Brakel that he had Newman Eberhart as his spiritual director. And his visits lasted about 2 minutes because he'd go in, Eberhart would say, "How are you?" "I'm fine." "And do you have any questions?" "Not really." "Okay, see you next month."
I'm sure, I'm amazed to hear that.
But that reminds me, reading that chapter,
Yeah,
when he was talking about asking those questions about in the old fashion of using the Aristotelian categories.
yes,
What I recalled, partly because we have these talks and Newman's name comes up, is at the beginning of his big text on history. He talks about the matter and the form and so forth and so on to enlighten us about the intelligibility of the task he set himself when he wrote this book. And, you know, I thought that was very interesting at the time I read it. And I wondered, would I ever do that? I can tell you for sure I never did.
Ah.
But in a sense, it goes against the historical consciousness that was that he was saying you have that Miller was saying that you have to take account of, which Lonergan spent his 35 years or 50 years trying to appropriate and pass on. All my work, he said, is devoted to bringing history into theology.
Mhm.
So what's good is that, as we can tell from John, a lot of history has been brought into theology, and he has absorbed a lot. Excuse me, not John, but Tom. A lot of history has been brought into our enrich our understanding of Christianity and many other things as well.
Yes,
I don't know if you read my comment. That was Dr. Hardy, Ken Hardy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And
First name.
my comment was, you know, if you watch that video, what struck me, and I sort of obsessed over it, was the fact that here is this Black man, psychologist, very professional, giving a lecture to a very serious audience, and the over-the-ear microphone was skin toned to blend in with white skin. And
Like Johnson and Johnson Band-Aids.
yeah, precisely. And I was sensitive to it because of the number of African priests that I've had in parishes where I've served. And, you know, we simply could not get without going to, you know, your basic electronics black, you could not get a skin toned microphone that's designed to be as invisible as possible for a person with dark skin. I think some of them are available now, but the other thing that I also commented on that in my reply was, you know, something that I was aware of, you know, that if we go back far enough in our genealogy, each one of us is going to encounter rape in part of our heritage.
yes, that really jumped out.
Yeah, and then something I heard last week, you know, that nearly all light-skinned African Americans cannot identify the individual ancestor who is responsible for that light skin because it was rape on the part of the slave owners.
Yes.
And that struck me.
There's a history professor at Harvard named Gates,
Yeah.
who on PBS had a thing about genealogy and
Yeah.
how people are surprised to find out what the genealogy was like. Although I have only seen it a few times, and the question of rape never came up. But
Yeah, I've watched it a few times, and no, that question never did come up. But I find, well, I'm finding genealogies fascinating. I'm trying to, get into my Welber's side and my Geffrey side. My mother's maiden name was Geffrey, and
What kind of a name is that? French?
uh, it it actually is probably originally French, but a Germanized French. My grandparents came; they were German Russians who came from the area around Odessa, upstream from Odessa in the Ukraine, dominated by Russia at that time, of course. And uh, they had been, their ancestors had been brought in by Catherine the Great, who herself was German, um, to help to develop Russia. And they were mostly farmers from various parts of Germany who were brought in there. And prior to the Russian Revolution, uh, under the late czars, things were getting rather dicey for them, and many of them migrated to the Dakotas and Nebraska. And so there is a whole colony of, and very active, I'm finding, colonies of German Russians in the Dakotas and Nebraska.
Did anybody inquire or opine that that weather was the most similar to the areas from which they moved? Or was there some other major factor?
I bet that's true. Ukraine was called the breadbasket of Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. That may have been. I would suspect that they didn't have a great deal of choice in that. Foreigners who came in at that time basically were moved out west because land was available and cheap.
Yep.
And then a few people from a few families from one area settle somewhere, and more families from the same area get wind of it, and so they form their little communities back there. Weather may have been a certain part of it. I suspect they would not have found Arizona to be very hospitable.
Right, for sure.
You threw light on a mystery in my knowledge of my grandmother. I lived with her for a couple of years, and I know she spoke Ukrainian because she was Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, and German.
Mhm,
And I wondered how German got in there.
mhm.
I wonder if it had to do with what you're talking about, your
Yeah.
grandparents.
Yeah, well, and the other thing is Catherine the Great herself was German.
Jawohl.
And she, it's very fascinating and kind of, it's very convoluted, her story, because she basically was brought in as the not very willing bride of one of the czars, and actually ended up being, through a variety of palace intrigues, ended up being the ruler. And sort of Black Widow fashion, I guess, killed off those who actually did end up bringing her in, who were trying to prevent her from gaining power. She was as I understand it, a rather sexually promiscuous person as well, and loved the good life and so on. But
History gets you into.
But she refused to suppress the Jesuits.
that's right. I think she probably saw them as an advantage because they were part of bringing learning. I'm just speculating here, but they would have been part of bringing learning into a country that she, was trying to develop, that, was just horribly, in her estimation, horribly backward.
I think too, Tom, it had to do with keeping the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church at bay.
That sounds logical.
Yeah, I mean, like, okay, you know, I have an alternative to you.
Yeah. Be nice if somebody did that today.
But the thing you said about being educated, when I went to a German-speaking university, you meet all the persons in grad studies who went to gymnasiums,
Mhm.
which the humanistic gymnasiums, at the age of about between 6th and 7th grade, they take tests,
Mhm.
figure out who's going to go to the technical schools and who's going to go to the liberal arts schools. And they knew they had no trouble with Greek, German, Latin, besides having a fair number of brains. So that might have something to do with their greatness, besides killing off the ungreat.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
You've reminded me of part of the Grimmer history. My great grandfather was a bootmaker in Germany. And when he emigrated to avoid military service, when he emigrated, he found work as a bootmaker for the barges and the ships that went up and down the Ohio River in Pittsburgh area. His brother was academic and came to the US at the same time and went to New Orleans and got a teaching job. But there was just that difference in aptitude of two Grimmer brothers and how they ended up in the US.
Mhm. Did any of you happen to see on the PBS NewsHour a couple of months ago, they had a program about how there is a shortage, a serious shortage of skilled electricians and plumbers and carpenters and people like that, simply because there are many people who don't want to do that kind of skilled work, which also involves heavy labor. Heavy labor, and they're having a great deal of difficulty. You know, they're instituting a variety of programs in smaller plumbing firms and electrical firms where they are bringing in apprentices and paying them very, very well for, instead of flipping burgers, paying them to learn this trade in which they may very well end up making six figures.
Good point, Tom. Yesterday, I visited with the contractor that's doing a lot of work on my property here in Palm Desert. And one of his workers was doing some fine-tune wall work. They call it mud work. Does that ring a bell? Anyway, the contractor explained to me that this kid came to him from Mexico. But he came to him from Mexico because his father, the worker's father, had worked for this contractor for 15 or 20 years. And so when he was ready to retire, he brought his son up from Mexico legally and got him work. And this kid's making 25, 30 bucks an hour. He's so good. He got his training in Mexico. But he had a sponsor in the contractor for the job that he came to.
I have a question for you, Fred. When you lived with your grandmother, did she talk about the famine, the terror famine in the Ukraine at all?
She was way before that.
Ah,
She came in 1915. So, but what John said about his forebears avoiding the military, the main motive for their coming to the States was that to avoid inscription into the into the Russian army. So
you said 1950. Did you mean 1850?
1915.
Oh, all right. I misunderstood.
Yeah.
But they stayed pretty aware of those things. She used to get the Ukrainian newspaper, and there were widowers in the neighborhood who were Ukrainian, and she would meet with them to read the paper every week because she was the only one who could read. And so she was aware of things going on there.
Mhm.
And while I was in Rome, I was often cautioned by my mother, don't think of going to the Ukraine. I never did think of it, but she
Mhm.
made me think that that's a no-no.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. What you said there were Ukrainian widowers in the neighborhood. What neighborhood was this?
it was in outside of Coatesville, Pennsylvania.
Uh-huh.
And they came, the father and then the three older boys all worked at Lucan's steel mill. And apparently I used to be taken to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and my uncle would have to go. And after a while, I found out that my uncle spent most of the time gabbing with other men down in the cellar of the. And I spent a lot of time there finding out how they were great fighters. Although you don't know what the BS quotient was, but still.
What part of the state is that, Fred?
It's I think it's about 30 or 40 miles south of Philadelphia.
Got it. My dad worked in the shipyards of Philadelphia when I was born. So
Oh.
I was born in that same general area, but then we moved back to Pittsburgh where his roots were, and steel mills and the river business.
Oh, yeah.
Remember the movie The Deer Slayer?
No.
Deer Hunter.
No,
wasn't it?
Deer Hunter, I guess. Okay. About the I guess they were, I don't know if they were Russian Orthodox or Ukrainian Orthodox, but a community in Pennsylvania where everybody went off to the Vietnam War. Remember the infamous Russian roulette scene? You have to have seen that movie, Fred.
I have not, but I look forward to it now that you recommend it.
Well, I don't know. It's not cheerful particularly.
Yeah, I've got to see it too. My friend who, that I'm living with here, Karen, is from Weirton, West Virginia, which is just, in the panhandle, right between Pennsylvania and Ohio. And I guess the Weirton steel mill was where they filmed parts of it.
Uh-huh.
It's a sad story.
Well, I guess we get enough of that in daily life.
Yes.
Skip it.
Yeah, what was it? Art should hold the face up to nature. Well, what can I say? Has anybody seen the Molly Maguires? Speaking of Pennsylvania,
No.
that's an interesting movie. It's Sean Connery's in it, and Richard Harris. And Richard Harris plays a very ambitious coal miner. I think they're Welsh, or no, maybe they're Irish. but who betrays his fellow Molly Maguires, who were sort of a terrorist organization, and is a Pinkerton spy in the mine. Worth seeing if you're interested in Pennsylvania history.
Yeah,
That sounds interesting.
Yeah, it is.
tell you a fun, quick machine shop story. My dad served his apprenticeship at Curtis Wright steel mill in the machine shop there. And that's where he learned his trade. Well, they got every hour coffee and cigarette break. And they'd go outside of the machine shop by the river. And you might have seen pictures of machinists always wore a work apron to catch the oil and all that. And there'd be pockets in the apron down by your thighs. And my dad would see other machinists taking parts out of their pocket and throwing them in the river, essentially getting rid of their mistakes. And my dad would tell that story to every new employee who came to work at Grammar Machine and Tool, and essentially say, come to me with your mistakes and we'll fix it, but don't try to throw them in the river. and it worked. He
Our
was
only river is dry anyway.
well, yeah. Anyhow, he said the Ohio River probably had 3 feet worth of mistakes built up over the years.
Interesting. George,
Sir,
are you back home?
I am.
Are you presentable?
Yes. Well, that's a relative term, but by my standards, yeah.
Yeah. Well, why don't you start your video so we can see your handsome.
How do I do that? Well, where it says George Crook?
Well, I think there's 3 little dots in the upper
Yeah.
right.
Oh, wait a minute. It says start video.
Oh,
Okay.
down below. It says start video. That's
I cannot start my video because the host has disabled it. It tells me.
okay. Let
And
me.
I want you to know that I resent that.
I'm
As
sorry.
would we
Okay.
all.
I'm just getting tired of
There I
There
am.
you are.
There I
Hello,
am.
George.
Sort of.
Hello,
There you
hello.
are.
Sorry
Greetings.
about that. How can I make amends, George?
I don't see how you can.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, then I will carry that
Just
carry
live
that
with it,
burden
Tom.
into eternity.
You're just gonna live with that part. Lonergan would tell
Okay.
you some of those things you just have to live with, right?
That's right. That's right.
I'm really frustrated that I missed Ferrick's comments. I just have, we're getting ready to go away for 10 days and I've not been much on the internet. And that's when we finally get the Lonergan stuff. And, oh, well.
Oh, well.
Well, Welbers is skilled at recording. So Tom, I'm sure you can encourage George. He can access that.
Well, this meeting is being recorded. And remember, you can, when you watch it on YouTube, you can speed it up.
Yeah. Well,
Are all the sessions that we've had since you first started recording still there for us to see?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah. In fact, I can send you a link to the playlist that contains all of them.
That would be delightful.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, and
Yeah.
I'm not sharing those links with anybody else.
Great.
But it gives Tom, you doing that gives a gravitas to our remarks that otherwise wouldn't have been apparent to me. It's flattering.
Well, you realize that, you know, after you all die, I will compile these into a book. Tell all of the.
That's also recorded now.
Just so the CIA doesn't find out.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Right, right.
Well, with regard to the Lonergan thing, um, I'm not sure how to proceed. And I suppose I have thought that perhaps after you've read the chapter, you had some questions or wanted to hear more about something. And that's
I'm
why.
gonna raise my hand on
Great.
this, because if you don't mind, I'm still quite fuzzy on absolute finality, horizontal finality, and vertical finality.
You know, John, before we get into that, I haven't read it. I know George hasn't. I don't know, Tom, whether you have begun it.
I actually skimmed it because I've been too busy turning pages and
Yeah.
clicking the photo button.
And
You know,
amazing footnotes.
yeah, what I think might be a good idea is Fred, if you could give us a preview of what we might expect, and it might serve as a framework or a structure, a preface that would help us more easily read and understand. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, I mean, given the circumstances, it does. So,
In the circumstances in which two guys haven't done their homework.
Yeah.
Crooked Chavero.
And if John is asking
how
questions
much
that
is
we
done
don't,
by skimming. So
What did you say, Fred?
I don't know how much one gets out of the chapter by skimming it.
Well,
Although-
that's three of us then, Welbers.
We have an
Yeah,
extraordinary brain like Welber's.
I don't, Lonergan is not one to be skimmed is
That
my,
reminds me of a wonderful Woody Allen joke. Remember those advertisements you'd see about Helen, somebody teaches speed reading, take her course, and you'll be able to.
Mhm.
Oh,
Uh-huh.
Woody Allen said, I took one of those speed reading courses and it worked. I read War and Peace in an hour.
Love that
Evelyn
guy.
Wood. Evelyn Wood was.
Evelyn Wood, that's
Sure.
right.
Yep.
Trying to
Okay.
dredge it up.
So he, at the beginning, he's talking about the context that Lonergan was entering into. And what it had to do with is the fact that theology in the scholastic form in which we got it early on was a product of rationalism. And so he's comparing isms to, so it's good to be rational, but it's not good to be a rationalist. And so also he starts off talking about the difference between classical, which is good. I spend an awful lot of my teaching introducing people to classics in theology and philosophy and other sciences as well. But classicism is, if you think of classics as corpses, that's bad. But that's what classicism does. It puts it in a deep freeze. It also tends to be phony. That is to say, it uses rhetoric to a great extent, and I remember many people through my life who were good at this. They use rhetoric to cover up the fact that they really don't know what they're talking about. So there is a certain way in which a big sign of this was the transition from that came in the defensive period, in which, so roughly speaking, in modernity, starting in the 16th century, where the church was under pressure because of the Reformation, but the church was already a kind of heavy mother. So one of the motives for a really awful person, but a brilliant person who influenced our lives tremendously, although we may not realize it, Machiavelli. He, in a way, you could say what he was doing to some extent, and which you couldn't blame him for, was getting the church off people's backs. And if you remember much about Renaissance popes and so forth, you realize they're not exactly models of virtue.
Feudal rulers, yeah?
Yes. But also, every way you can think of being not particularly moral, they were experts at that. And their families were. They were all those big names, Medici's and so forth, who always got to have that honor. So that was a good thing, but the reaction against it was awful. And the reaction really turned out to be what Machiavelli called, that when he wrote The Prince, he said, the reason why I wrote The Prince, which was such an important book for all the great founders of liberal democracy, starting with Hobbes and Locke and going on, is that he wasn't interested in the classical way of talking about that the end of our lives is to know everything about everything in Aristotelian terms, or to know God. But really all we're interested in when we talk about political order, and he claims to be introducing new modes and orders, is verita effettuale, effectual truth. In other words, he would so welcome, without any compromise, technocratic mentality that we're suffering under big tech today, which was one of the leading topics of our last week's conversation. That's what we're stuck with, and that was really a way of what Lonergan called bringing theory about humanity, in other words, philosophy of Aristotle, etc., and Thomas Aquinas, into line with bad practice. So that was bad news, and it yielded bad news in political orders, and it was very threatening to the church, because the church wasn't just an awful institution led by awful people, but it is the mystical body of Christ. So you had, on the one hand, the rise of modern science, which we think about in terms of Descartes and what's the name? Francis Bacon.
Bacon. Yeah.
And Francis Bacon said, well, now what we consider science, it has to be simply oriented toward the relief of man's estate. So all the conveniences we're so happy about, that's the point. And Descartes, in the last book, last chapter of the Discourse on Method, said that the purpose of modern science is to be masters and possessors of nature. In other words, if we have to wreck the environment, wreck the planet for our own good, it's okay. Because as Keynes put it, in the long run, we're all dead. So this was not a wonderful thing. And so that got into what you call rationalism, rather than reasonableness in an authentic sense. And the church couldn't help but be affected by that. And so that's why we have a bureaucratic church today. And all, as I think I said before, the point of bureaucracies, according to the great German sociologist, founder of sociology in a way, is power. And we see that all the time in the church. And if you're devoted to power, you figure out how to become a cardinal or a bishop. And I know I was in school with a lot of guys who figured that out and played that game. And everybody was conscious of it. Oh, he'll be a bishop.
This is in Rome, Fred, or you're gonna,
At the North American College.
yeah.
Wouldn't that be everywhere? I mean, not just in Europe, but are you specifically talking about Europe?
Well, I think there are people in every seminary
Yeah.
who are doing it as a way of escaping from life, or also seeing how they can get a certain kind of power.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that.
You know, just an aside, Herbert had gone to the same elite Jesuit school in New York, the name of which is escaping me, that McCarrick went to.
Fordham, was it?
Fordham Prep, yeah.
Yeah, Fordham Prep.
Yeah, and but he was a year, I guess McCarrick was a year ahead of Herbert, but and he would tell Herbert's friend Ernie Sweeney, who also became a Jesuit, a classmate, well, here's how I'm going to get to be the Cardinal Archbishop of New York. I'll go to seminary across the river in Newark or Atlantic City, whatever it is, and be ordained over there and be a big fish in a small pond, and rapidly rise. And then there'll be an opening in New York, and that's where I'll wind up. And this was in high school. And he told Ernie, Dad, that's what Cardinal Hayes did. Or I think it was Cardinal Hayes. It'll work for him.
Figures.
Huh?
I've been told,
Charismatic figures.
I've been told that Cardinal Mahoney very carefully planned how to rise in that way.
I don't believe it. I think he sincerely wanted to work with Mexican migrants.
Oh yeah, he did. I mean, his heart was in the right place there, but he did want power, and when he got it, boy, did he use it.
Well, that he was a real strategic guy. If he could see that the road to Los Angeles lay through Fresno.
Fresno, yeah.
I mean, what a genius.
And he made friends with the right folks. For instance, Cardinal Manning, apparently he was a very close and loving friend. And by that, I mean, just had a good rapport, etc. And once he became a cardinal,
once he became an archbishop.
Archbishop, yeah. He had no use for him, or maybe there just wasn't time. He had more important things to do.
Well, there's some way of saying that the way he behaved in relation to the sex abuse crisis,
yes,
bears that out.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately,
not an A+. Yeah. But I'm a Mahoney defender, but that, that was bad, and it was so that all this internal stuff, these email, it was just bad. And I'm told that in retirement he's very devoted to the cause of the immigrants.
Yes.
Still, as he always was, and he seeks to go around the country at Catholic universities, advocating for the immigrants. And many places will not accept his presence because they consider him to have disgraced himself in the pedophile cover-up.
Yeah.
And from my experience, he accepts that probably in a way that he never would have before. In other words, for what happened to him, for which he bears a sufficient amount of responsibility, he could just have simply closed himself up in anger and bitterness and just, I'm not going to do anything. But he just kind of steadfastly goes about giving the kind of witness he feels that he can. And I think the sex abuse crisis has kind of humbled him in a way that he doesn't let himself be blocked by this bad, how would I say, the condemnations of bad publicity and people who are out to criticize him, sometimes even rightly.
I think that confirms what George was saying. He really did have and does have a heart for the poor and particularly farm workers.
Mhm. Yeah.
But the way he understood that he had to handle himself was as efficiently as possible. And that meant, in many instances, just starting and cutting things off, being in a lot of ways, what might be characterized by some as ruthless.
Yeah.
But still, he had this vision, as George is talking about. And I agree with you, Tom, that
Well, this is important. I think it's good to bring out all those things. And
yeah,
it's an aspect of a function of the teaching of Machiavelli, namely that you could figure out a good reason for doing bad things. So he could have been a climber because he really justifying it to himself because of all the good he could do for that big central concern of him. And he never gave that up. And also the idea that he was humbled, I would take it to mean he's also repentant.
I agree.
And people, that can happen to people. We believe that the Holy Spirit is given even to climbers.
But I don't think,
he's in residence at St. Charles. And I know that the RCIA team in that parish, and some of them don't like him, but he's a very dedicated confessor. People love going to confession to Roger Michael Mahoney. Now, go figure. Who would have thought, But and I've got a confession to him, and he is quite good.
Well, I'm sorry, my classmate Norm Prieb, who's passed away. We can't check all this out with him. He was a salt of the earth guy.
He was.
Amazing.
Very much so.
Norm, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, very much so.
Not a climber, right, Fred?
Oh, he was excellent in every way.
Yeah.
He was smart. He was good. He was almost so good you couldn't believe it.
I remember talking with him
myself. So yeah, he was just a wonderful person, and he's one of the people in my class whom I have thought about through the years a lot. Another one I think not quite as the same way of is Steve Blair.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I think he was in this more or less on that vein.
I got to know him pretty well when he was an auxiliary here, and you did too, Ned. Then he became Bishop of Stockton.
Stockton is right. Yep.
Yeah, and he became a good friend of my brother-in-law's, who was Bishop of San Bernardino Riverside, and my brother-in-law hadn't gone to seminary here. So, he met him as a fellow bishop. Remember the time, Ned, we had Steve and my brother-in-law in to talk to the Justice of Peace Commission about social justice, in part so I could throw tantrums at them. Steve was a good man. He was humble, and
Fred is right on target. I mean, just the bullseye. I agree with you about Norm completely, and Steve was a little more sociable, more I don't know, relational. Norm, I remember talking with him about stuff, and he'd stop, and I remember he'd go like this and think and say, I'll talk to you later, and sure enough, we'd talk later, and he was quite smart. I really liked him.
Yeah.
remember how fast he could run?
Oh,
Oh, do I?
Absolutely.
like the wind.
Yeah.
I was going to mention that. Yeah, it was amazing. Anyway, yeah, so we're talking about these guys going to being climbers.
Mhm.
In Stephen Birmingham's book, I can't remember the title of it, he has a little passage there about Cardinal Spellman and his father. When Spellman decided to go to the seminary, his father was supposed to have said, stick around the people who are really smart. And in your case, that won't be very hard.
And he became the American Pope. I mean, there's never been a prelate with the kind of clout he had.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he did a good thing in terms of Nostra Aetate. He really pushed that in Rome for the council.
Well,
He wasn't alone. I just said he wasn't alone.
yeah, well, and he rescued John Courtney Murray from the Vatican silence. I mean, as I understand it, Spellman showed up at the first session without a peritus, and then read the lay of the land and came back with John Courtney Murray. And in the second, and Herbert was John Courtney Murray's secretary at the Vatican Council. So he had stories.
John Courtney Murray taught theology at Woodstock.
Yep.
He taught Lonergan's Latin texts. And everybody who had that, that came to Europe to do grad studies, couldn't stand Lonergan because of John Courtney Murray. But I esteemed him really a lot, and he did really appreciate Lonergan. And I remember when he did come to Rome, I asked him how Lonergan was because he'd had that lung removed. And he said he's really doing well. And I was grateful to hear that news from him. And he wrote a book which really did more or less borrow, which is published by Yale University Press. And it was about both De Deo Uno and De Deo Trino. And he did a lovely job. He could express himself in such an excellent way. It was rhetoric, but it wasn't cover-up rhetoric.
Spellman.
So it helps to be a good rhetorician. I'm not down on that.
Spellman?
No, John
Murray.
Murray. I'm sorry. Yeah.
So anyway,
Herbert gently implied that Murray kind of put on airs. I remember he was talking about at his Murray had developed a manner of speaking, and it sounded like a very cultivated accent, aristocratic, I guess. And at John Courtney Murray's funeral, he was talking to Murray's sister, who said to him in New Jersey ease, and Herbert, who was a gifted mimic, imitated her accent. You know, tell me, how come John talk so funny? You know, he'd left his New Jersey accent long behind, and it practiced not having one. You know, was the inference that I drew, at least.
Oh no, that's often said. Like, why did he take his mother's maiden name and make it his middle name? If you didn't say John Courtney Murray and you just said John Murray, it would have sounded so different.
Ah.
Yeah, no, that's,
There's something to that. Although,
Wow.
I feel a little bad about bad mouthing these people, since we all have our shortcomings. But
Well,
at any rate, there's a way. I'm talking about, in some sense, Machiavelli's idea in book 15. Those, he says, those who do what they think they ought to do, namely be virtuous, are going to just come to ruin. So let's replace virtue with virtu, which means skill in calculating the most efficient means to your end. And this has a lot to do with what we talked about earlier. To some extent, if you're an American, you get socialized into that.
mhm.
And of course, the ones you admire, like that Ken, what was his last name? Tom?
Oh, Hardy, Ken Hardy, was it?
Yeah, Ken Hardy. I mean, you can't help but read that and look up to him. And Aristotle always said, friendship. If you want to become a friend of someone you look up to. And chances are the reason why you look up to him, that there's a probability that he'll be friendly to you. And you can think of in your own life how often that's been the case.
Yep.
And how your life has been changed by those kinds of people.
All you have to do is look around this screen.
Yeah, I do. And I believe it. So anyway, you had that thing about calculation and mastery and control, which comes from Machiavelli. And the church, you have to admit, the church didn't just be Machiavellian. The first human science that was really got to be well developed was law. And so the church really set up its structures in accord with Roman ideas about law. And it wasn't just, oh, let's follow Machiavelli. But once again, that other socialization process has its toll, takes its toll. So it resisted the Reformation on the one hand, and the rise of modern science on the other hand, and then critical history on the other hand, because the early people who were discovering that the scriptures weren't just more or less dictated by God's mouth to the authors who were inspired, they have a history of development and so forth. A lot of what you study in scripture studies is, and that what you were introduced to. I don't quite remember Panzini's course, but he didn't emphasize that, I'm sure.
No.
Not at all.
But if you go to most other schools where people, I noticed when I went to Rome, that a lot of the seminaries who had really well-known intellectual teachers tended to have gone into scripture studies.
Oh,
Bruce Botter is a Vincentian.
mhm.
Ray Brown as a Sulpician. And another guy, I can't remember the one at the name of the one at Dunwoody in New York. So the guys who had brains
Meyer?
go for that, huh?
Meyer?
No, he would have taught Meyer,
Oh, okay.
and I think inspired Meyer to do what he did, has done. I mean, so anyway, so you're against those three things, and so the Reformation, that's a big threat. Modern science is a big threat because it seems to call, it does more than call the origin of the universe in a way that the Bible doesn't agree with. And thirdly, history, because it gets you into having to relativize it from that point of view. Everything you thought you knew for sure as true. And so there was legitimate reasons for being against those things. But that caused what Miller calls classicism, which means to have to in a certain sense abandon the notion of, say, the development of doctrine, abandon reading scripture very much because, well, don't worry about scripture because you can depend on dogma. And the texts in theology would be called dogmatic theology. And dogmas are rules of faith, and they are what you believe, as we do when we see witness baptisms of adults on Holy Saturday and so forth. They go through the creed. Do you believe this? Do you believe that? Belief is good, but belief is, as you know, whenever you do believe, and we all, most of what we know, we depend on from others. You're figuring out whether whoever is telling you something you don't know and you think you need to know, whether they're knowledgeable and whether they're trustworthy. So according to the doctrine of belief, God is the one revealing. So pretty much you're pretty sure he'd be telling the truth. And so you hold as true whatever you couldn't have figured out by your own lights. And that's a good thing to do. We do it every day. We believe, I think all of us believe that taking the vaccines was a good idea. And we don't believe the people who say all the different things, the way it's been politicized about not doing that. So belief is a good thing, but if you just talk about dogma and don't emphasize the scriptures, in fact, don't even encourage people to read the scriptures. And if you think about the spiritual life simply in terms of continuing to be faithfully attending Mass, et cetera, and the holy days of obligation, novena, if you want to throw that in, and so forth, that's not really inculcating a deep spiritual life. Now, I'm not saying that all the people who did that did not have deep spiritual lives, because I know very well firsthand many who did that and are deeply holy people. But still, for the hoi polloi, then the scandalous thing is that in the Baltimore Catechism, which probably we were all brought up on early, except when it's talking about the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, except it was always called charity. You didn't necessarily connect it with love. You don't find the word love in the Baltimore Catechism. So something's missing. there.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes, we do. Why did God made me? God made me to know, love, and
Hmm.
serve him in this world.
Yeah, the first sentence, and that's it.
That was
Yeah,
a
okay.
yeah.
So that's good so far.
Fred,
Uh-huh.
At any rate, that wasn't a great introduction to the faith.
Fred,
And
that
I'm not sure that new catechisms are much better, but they should be. Go ahead then.
you know that is really helpful to me because one of my, and I think I've said it before, one of my greatest regrets about the seminary, although I had lots of wonderful things to be thankful for, but one of my greatest regrets was that we never really got a good sense of Scripture. We really never understood Scripture in the way that we can now understand reading about Scripture. You know, Ray Brown and I've got this Sacra Pagina series, which is so wonderful.
Oh, it is, yeah.
And I just think Father Panzini was just blown away, and no need to talk about that. He was a wonder. I love that man, but we didn't get the Scripture from him. But we could follow the dogmatic line, and because so much of it was the product of well thought through Scripture, we could stay, you know, close and become holy. We could look for perfection, and we could trust. But still, there was this awful hole in understanding dogma because we didn't get the Scriptures.
Right.
I'm done.
So the texts of dogma were ahistorical. So they used what's often contemned by people who know a lot of history, proof texts,
Mm-hmm.
taking opinions of people that you're against out of context and saying this guy is bad and this guy is bad, and then refuting them with your own texts in a way that's not really legitimate or honest. Not that these people who did it were dishonest, but they just didn't bring history into theology. And, and so there's this kind of fixism. And all the great theologians of the 20th century and the 19th century, people like Blondel and Ronner, and the people who really shaped the council from doing what they called ressourcement, going back to the fathers of the church and seeing how they thought about Scripture. They knew so much more about Scripture than we do, than we got, as Ned was just saying, and so forth. So classical is good, but classicism is ahistorical. It's anti-historical almost.
That's a
also,
good
pardon me.
No.
Excuse me. It also, the same thing was true about the way they taught philosophy. So you think about a person being a human substance, and a human substance is true that you have a nature, but they didn't really talk about human nature as an inborn principle of motion and rest. In other words, our natures are to change over time, and they do spontaneously, but you can't think of nature as something just stable and stuck. So our approach to natural law was in terms of logic. What's the rule? And let's grade the rules according to how how much we can deviate from them in a certain sense with casuistry. And are there any things that are just from the outset objectively wrong? Those kinds of questions were the things they kept asking about. It's not wrong to ask those questions, but it's not, there's some way in which that's not an adequate way to think about morality and ethics, not to mention being a good person in terms of the gospel. So that classical, classicist, I should say, approach really went together with the kind of bureaucratic approach of the church. And and so why did it happen that we now one thing I've always done all my life is be so glad I had all the teachers I had. And of course there are the ones that stood out, like Charlie Barr and Reedy and so forth, because they were not company men, obviously.
Yes, absolutely.
And so they were beloved in a way that the others were not quite the same. But I looked up to all of them. I thought they were all really good guys, and I liked them even when just exactly what Ned did with Panzini. Deficient as a scholar, but really a good person, and he loved him. He couldn't help but love him. See? And that's the way I felt about so many of my teachers there in the seminary throughout the years. And so, and you know, they had failings and so forth, but I always remember a person who really knew a lot about history and left the seminary in order to major in history at the University of California. His name was Heron.
Dave Heron, yeah, I remember him.
He would he would go on about how awful our history teacher, Father McCoy, was.
Oh, my.
Well,
Ted
Bruce
Howard.
Howard, when
Oh,
we
my
need him.
goodness.
And so that was non-historical history.
Get on the spot.
The what do they call those boiled down, the cliff notes of history or something?
And a little bit.
Yeah, but still,
skewed.
I can't help but think of him fondly because I know
BJ.
he really meant the best and really gave his life to us in as generous a way as possible, I think. And of course he was a character. So I'm not trying to put it all down, but there is a way in which when I got to be in Rome at the council, I realized that that theology really has a different level and a different way of being, and people who are actually able to do theology rather than repeat what the theology books say and so forth. And I always remember this: the tendency in philosophy courses. I don't know whether you recall this. You'd come to a point that was someone that asked a question about that, and the professor, in this case John Berger, would say, well, we won't go into that because you'll really get that more thoroughly in theology. And then when you get to theology, the same question comes up. We won't go into that because you've already had it in philosophy. So there were a lot of problems, but that had to do with the whole system. It was really forming us as to how to hold what is true, and homiletics to pass on what is true, in the way that Charlie Miller did really so beautifully teach us, but in the conversational style, and but still, there was a lot lacking. And you don't
Can
know.
I interrupt just for a second
Dude,
and take the scripture topic and link it to the homiletics by way of Tom Welber's? Because Tom, you had many years of preaching and many years of dedicated reading and reflecting on the scriptures of the particular mass of the day. I mean, you traveled lots of miles of linking that,
Mhm.
didn't you?
Well, yeah, and you know, as you're talking, I'm thinking, I think Panzini did give me a love of scripture, even if his teaching of it was deficient. And I combined that with my love of liturgy and getting behind liturgy, not just rubrics, which has been the bane of my life because everybody wants to ask me questions about rubrics rather than liturgy. You know, and combining the two, I think that I was one of the first ones that said, "Hey, we need to develop since we've got the gift of the lectionary, we need to develop a Bible study program around the lectionary." And that's what my Banquet of the Word, which started in Our Lady of Lourdes Parish in Northridge in 1976, 77, somewhere around there, shortly after I got back from Rome. Uh, uh, that's kind of what that developed from. Now everybody's doing it, and you know, I'm not going to go back and revise my Banquet of the Word, though it's still available online. But yeah, I've just kept going in that direction for whatever it's worth, and
No.
enjoying the trip.
it's what we mean by classical rather than classicist.
Yeah,
Yes.
which is related, actually, I think, to that other misused um, pair of terms, traditional versus traditionalism.
Yes. Yes, that's it.
You know,
Isms tend to be not so hot.
the authentic, and here's kind of what I'm getting out of translating what you're saying and what I, you know, gathered a little bit from reading about Lonergan, that you know, the council in merging aggiornamento and ressourcement all, you know, as a unified whole rather than two separate warring entities, you know, was being truly faithful, as Pope Francis is, truly faithful to tradition.
Oh, yes.
In contradistinction to the quote traditionalists on the one hand and the quote avant-garde on the other hand.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's wonderful. Wonderful comment. So, so the big thing is he wants to take account of first getting the church out of that fixist state in the direction of what Tom was just exemplifying and what you, John, brought out about him. And
yeah, thank you, John.
And secondly, to be able to take modern science seriously without going off the deep end. And there is a deep end. I just read the long obituary of a person who was a great Nobel Prize winner who did most of his physics at the University of Texas. But he, at the end of the obituary, it said, "One of my main concerns is to get rid of religion because religion just causes so much trouble in the world." and there isn't any meaning to anything in that sense. Of course, his performance in life contradicted that completely, because he found, investigating these wonderful things he did discover for the first time about the universe, as meaningful, but still, what he means there is something that has to do with the scandalous side of religious life, which he's reacting against. And that brings to mind a famous Latin quotation, corruptio optimi pessima.
Mhm.
Corruption of what's best is worst. So when we had to face the announcement that McCarrick is being brought to trial in the
Yes,
courts, you
right.
get that awful stab in your stomach where you know the lead worms in your stomach when you hear that, because what the hell, you just can't hardly believe it. And then when you get into the extent of the thing, it's just too much. And that was true of Burl and so forth. But anyway, um, so you had to take care of science. You had not to be afraid of science, and actually also be aware that, and this I got the picture of from Tom when we got that thing from Granville about process theology.
Oh, by the way, I have to add a footnote here. Granville Henry passed away on Tuesday morning,
Oh,
this past
God
week.
rest him. Huh.
He was in Minnesota, where his family roots are. And he was actually planning to come back to LA, but he was having such a good time with his family that he didn't, and just died rather peacefully and somewhat unexpectedly of whatever was ailing him at that time.
it's
So,
a consolation that his family didn't kill him.
yes, yes. So his wife Tess, who was very dear to me, both of them were, but his wife Tess died about a year and a half ago, shortly before the COVID outbreak. And so I officiated at her memorial mass. I don't know if there's going to be one for Granville or not.
But you could see how all the process philosophy and theology guys are really trying to take modern science seriously,
Mm-hmm.
recognize that challenge, and it has to be faced. I don't think they did it adequately, but still, you admire them for facing it rather than avoiding it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the other thing then is history, and in general what's called historical mindedness, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about our John brought it up, and we talked about that party guy, how we're socialized, how just think of those guys who were told by John's father, don't throw your mistakes away, bring them to me and we'll correct the mistakes, because that's what I did in my life. I wasn't throwing any screws down there or whatever the hell it was down the river. And I learned how to do things right, and I can teach you, and so forth. It's that kind of intellectual integrity that's so rare, and it just makes me so joyful to hear that description of Tom's father. John's father. I mean, so anyway, that's the deal. That we're all socialized and acculturated, and society and culture are constituted by meanings and values, and that becomes our constitutive meaning, and it changes at different times. So, for example, I think that was a beautiful thing that Tom said about Panzini, that he didn't teach it well, but he made me love it. That's a tremendous gift.
Yes, it is.
Wonderful thing. So if he could also pass on the gift while teaching it well, that would be
Imagine,
even better.
imagine.
But still, the love led Tom to appreciate doing it well, and to bring it alive in preaching on the texts of the day. So those three things are important. And then what he does is get into cosmology, Lonergan's cosmology. And one of the important things there is that there's not only classical method that is true, other things being equal, but in fact, other things are almost never equal because they're contingent. They're affected by a whole lot of things that aren't taken directly into account when you're studying the nature of something that is the way it is, like the falling body. I remember Father Wood giving, taking a sort of a vacuum tube and dropping two things that was an imperfect vacuum, but the thing, the feather and maybe it was a marble or something like that. And it was true that the marble didn't fall as fast as you thought it would, but it still fell faster than the feather. But still, why? Because other things aren't equal, yet the law is 32 feet per second per second. And so you have to take into account all those other matters. And the way you start to do that is through statistical method. And statistical method understands the intelligibility of probability. We're encountering this all the time. What we're hearing in the light of the tremendous heat waves in the western part of the state and the constant rain we're having in July here in the eastern part. It's never happened before this way. And scientists are admitting that they didn't think they thought we'd have to pass a further standard of climate change before these kind of very serious things happen. So it was just a matter of probabilities, the confluence of different things, the death, so to speak, of the jet stream that makes the heat hang over instead of being blown away by the usual wind that would come and relieve us after a while, and so forth. So this is all a matter of probabilities. And so what he talks about in that part is what he calls emergent probability. So early on in our reflections on what Ted Howard made possible for us to know, the enigma of Zeeman and so forth. How probable did you think there could be that? And then what Ned Shavira told us about Del Castillo, that awful experience he had with Judge Zeeman. Who would have thought it? You see, and we don't know what lies behind these weaknesses that people manifested, and how they're conscious of it in a way because the way they act ordinarily, you'd never believe they could be that possible way.
Yep.
But all kinds of things are operating organically, psychically, and so forth in relation to their milieu and the people they're around and so forth. We have no idea, basically. but it has to do with probability. It has to do with recurrence schemes. So the scheme of recurrence in which Don Worrell is a classic case in my NAC class, that he was on his way to become Cardinal Worrell. He was a company guy. He took over for that priest in, where was it, Washington or Oregon?
Seattle,
Huh?
Seattle, I believe.
Yeah.
Munchausen.
Yeah. Who was probably a priest of Yahweh.
Yes, very much so.
You couldn't take too many priests of Yahweh. You needed to have the organization man
Mhm.
take care of things, that kind of thing. So a priest of Baal would do better. I,
Not if he ran into Elijah that day.
I know, no, it wouldn't be. The still small voice. Let's try that. So you see the thing about, so there are recurrent schemes. In other words, what we've said about our seminary training, it was good, but it wasn't all it could be. And as Pat Zeman apparently said, it doesn't really take care of our emotional lives. In some ways, that was true. Although I don't actually buy it. But what my emotional life was made through friendships with certain members of the faculty and all kinds of students who
And I think
really
Ned and George particularly can reflect that with Father Louis Franz. And I can reflect that with Father Wood. Now, Louis Franz left seminary teaching and went on. I'll let you guys talk about that. But Bob Woods went to Africa to teach in seminaries there and went from, I think, when he taught us science, he was kind of a jerk. I mean, talk about rigid and insensitive. And knowing him 30 years later, after the work he did in Africa, was amazing. And I hope you'll mention a little bit about Franz and that too.
Let me make a comment about Father Wood. I couldn't stand him when I was a senior in high school. I mean, to say I despised him would probably be too strong, but I just thought he was a complete jerk. And just to me, he was petty. I mean, I saw him as petty and blinkers on and authoritarian. And fast forward, you got us together, you, me, Jerry Fallon.
That's right. Fallon was with us.
And I forget who else.
Ted Howard.
Teddy, to have dinner with Father Wood when he was returning to the United States from his missionary, he retired from his missions in Africa. And we had dinner at that restaurant in LA, remember, with all the cartoons of the political figures on the wall.
Yeah.
And oh my God, I mean, here we were. I mean, I couldn't believe the man, you know? I mean, well, I could because I'd had a bit of maturation in between being a senior. But he was wonderful. He was saintly. He was everything, you know, that he one would hope for, that a returning missionary. Full of love of his flock in Africa, you know, telling us about all their wonderful traits, how their culture contrasted with ours, and you know, the descriptions were to their advantage.
You remember? You remember
was,
where he did his missionary work in Africa?
Remember where?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was Nigeria.
Okay.
Where are the Maasai? Was
Huh?
it among the Maasai, John?
Oh, that was
I'm not sure. I'm
that
not
was
sure.
in West Africa,
Yeah.
not Northern Africa. But I don't know.
He talked about their culture and the way they handled offenses against the society. And it was like well, okay, let's not, am I right, John? Let's not so much try to punish the offender, but right the wrong. And they weren't he thought, just remarkably non-grudge bearing.
Yes,
Cool.
yes.
Remember.
Yeah.
I
think
just
the
like to
Maasai-
add, George, at that dinner, he also demonstrated almost a passion to hear from each one of us. Where did
Yeah.
our life take us?
And that wasn't the woods I remembered.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah.
That's true, yeah.
I thought of him somewhat the way you did when he taught us physics and so forth. But I kind of realized, I kind of felt sorry for him because I don't think he could help it.
He was newly ordained, and I think the glow was on him of his ordination. I don't know, Tom, some of your classmates may have taken that on in their early years.
Well, I sure did. I mean, I look back with horror at some of the stuff that I did to people in the name of God and the church. But we'll get into that.
Yeah, we gotta have George
Another
Farrick
word.
here for that
But-
discussion.
Right.
But what we're really talking about, that there is a glow and that it might lead to behaviors.
Oh, yeah.
That has to do with what Lonergan called schemes of recurrence.
Uh-huh.
And that has to do with the interconnection between different things that are kind of cyclical and they keep arising. So remember when the sex abuse scandal first broke out, you heard about guys that you knew or you've heard of. And then you started hearing that this thing went way, way back. It wasn't a new thing. That new revelations would be find out how they were covering things up for decades.
Mhm.
So there's something about recurrent schemes in seminaries, who goes, how they're mature in the seminary system and so forth and so on. That I remember when it first broke out, I think I already told you this. I said, I never realized there was anything like that going on all my years in the seminary. I had no clue. I mean, I knew people who were probably gay, but I didn't think there was any of this other stuff going on. And a guy in my parish was definitely that way, and we worked together during the summers for the parish and so forth. So I just never believed that could be possible almost, but the recurrent schemes and if you're as blind as I was, then you missed it. But Father Wood, I used to go and ask him questions about things, and he was, even then, he was very kind to me in a way that was different from the way he operated in class in general.
Mhm.
And so I'm so happy to hear that. That's a wonderful thing. That would be a recurrent scheme in Africa. The last time the Boston Celtics won the championship, it was the year that they got a couple of stars from other teams on the team. And one of them had the idea of let's practice Ubuntu. Have you guys heard of that? Ubuntu really is a way of, the basic motto of Ubuntu is, I am because you are.
Ooh,
And so that meant, it spelled out a way of being teamwork
Hmm.
and working together for the cause. Everybody has tremendous talents, and some more than others, but still, we're going to use teamwork. And then I found out, because Africans come to Boston College to be Lonergan Fellows, that pretty much all throughout, in Kenya and Nigeria at least, they have a version of that in their own cultures. And so those recurrent schemes that are built up, if you're educated, that way they talked about punishment. That the point of the punishment is really to head towards the good.
correction, yes.
Mhm.
I think that was a beautiful story about Bob, Father Woods.
Yeah, and by the way, I just looked it up. Masai is in Kenya.
Oh, it is
Kenya.
I started to say Kenya before I said Maasai, so I don't know if I remember correctly or not, Fred, but
Well,
Sounds right.
they go together.
yeah.
I'm looking at the clock and I'm sorry, I've got things I need to get
Yeah,
off to.
we all do. I would like to say just kind of two things, maybe to close up. Thank you, Fred, for kind of, how would I say, enriching our last hour here. Maybe we can figure out how to continue this using Mark's book. But today marks the midpoint of my radiation therapy. So hopefully, by the end of August, hopefully the radiation will have done its thing, and those nasty little renegade prostate cells will be history. God knows. So
How does it seem to be going, Tom?
it's really going very well. It's totally painless. You don't feel a thing. I think I'm beginning to find some side effects, mainly in bowel and bladder habits. But
Similar to mine, Tom.
but there's no pain involved or anything so far.
That's great.
Oh,
And,
wonderful. We keep praying for you.
yeah, well, thank you.
That's a promise.
I do appreciate that. So should we make this is my second point, should we make any kind of commitment with regard to Miller's book to maybe ask questions of Fred and one another, perhaps, in preparation for next week?
Can we set a goal of reading and reflecting on chapter 1 and 2, which is about 30 pages total or something?
Oh, both chapters are just 30 pages. John?
I think the total of the 2 chapters is about that.
Okay. I was going to say,
The total of the 2 chapters is 44 pages.
Okay,
how
About
about
20,
then?
about 20 pages each.
But my wife spoke up behind me and told me, shut up.
Oh my goodness.
She did not. She did not. She just told me she did not. But I mean, I'm sorry to go on so long.
Yeah.
Are you serious?
Oh,
It was,
Please don't think.
next time, go on longer.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
What she really,
we should start with it earlier.
she just told me what she really said was, let them talk.
Well,
You do.
We talk all the time,
we
Fred.
can talk, yeah, we can talk
Yeah.
more diligently after we understand what you're saying and you're making it very understandable. It's
Oh.
great.
Hey,
There-
Stu, we're talking enough. We're happy with it.
Yeah, amen.
Get her in here.
I think it was my interrupting when you were talking about the change in Father Wood.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, one thing about him, I was going to say earlier, he was really smart. I mean, he was a very smart man.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it was just so sweet to see him towards the end of his life as an old man, a returning missionary. It was just lovely.
I have to say this before we go, Fred. And that is Father Wood interacted with my dad because we built our rocket, which
Oh.
you saw in the book, at Grimmer Machine and Tool. So
Oh.
I had the two of them together. What a blessing. Oh,
Oh, that
Yeah.
was wonderful.
With that, shall we call it? Call it
Not
Morgan?
quite,
Well,
not quite, just not quite. I gotta say this. I really appreciate Fred's comment about how he liked and loved the Vincentians. Because so did I. And so did
did
we
I.
all, I think. I don't know about Tom. Certainly Ned and John
Yeah.
did.
Well, I
Except for
did too,
maybe
very
Father Graham and Father Wood. But
Yeah.
Well, there were the blips, but those guys were wonderful. I mean, can you imagine? All those guys.
But they were just simple men, really.
Yeah.
The ones we had in San Fernando.
Yeah.
They were good. They were, I think we probably were blessed to have them compared with perhaps what was going on in other places.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that-
Remember Father Daspit, just so fondly.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Anyway, call it
Lingua
quits.
Latina, lingua sacerdotis.
Something like that.
That
Yeah.
was the motto of the Latin Club.
Right. Well, God bless you all.
Thank
And
you.
No, thank
thank
you.
you so much. And
God
we'll
bless
see
you.
about our business.
Thank
All
you.
right.
all right.